Hello, I'm Tim Peacock, a volunteer at Pendon Museum. Welcome to this episode of Views of the Vale, which starts and finishes in the village of Fernham, about 2 miles north of Uffington. I'm in front of Cottage and standing within sight of 4 buildings modelled at Pendon. I'm not sure that there is anywhere else that you can stand and see that many. Sadly, it could have been 5 buildings, but the cottages that were next to Cottage were demolished in the 1970s. We're going to tour several villages and settlements: Balking, Woolston and Britchcom Farm, all close to Uffington. Uffington itself is covered in a separate episode of Views of the Vale. At the end of the tour, we will return here to look at the buildings in Fernham.
The road south from Fernham runs under the GWR main line and then, on the outskirts of Uffington, passes Wharf Farm, next to what was the Wilts and Berks Canal and a wharf supplying Uffington. At Pendon, the model is called Wharf Cottage. A photograph of Uffington Wharf taken around 1900 shows Wharf Cottage with its then distinctive sloping roof, the 2 adjoining houses, some derelict barges and the canal lift bridge. A photograph taken in 1920 shows the lift bridge still being used over the canal, which by then had been abandoned. Wharf Cottage is much altered today, the sloping roof having been replaced in the early 1980s when an additional storey was added. Fortunately, the original roof has been captured in the Pendon model. The Wilts and Berks Canal, opened in 1810, linked the Kennet and Avon Canal to the River Thames at Abingdon, providing a transport route between the West Country and the Midlands. The canal enjoyed commercial success for about 30 years, and in 1837 carried 44,000 tons of coal from the Somerset coalfield, but then fell into decline after the arrival of the Great Western Railway. A short stretch of the abandoned canal next to Wharf Cottage is modelled at Pendon. Wharf Cottage has another connection with Pendon. The late Marcella Seymour, who lived at Britchcom Farm for many years, was born in Wharf Cottage, although she knew it as Wharf House.
I went to Pendon, my son came with me, and he suddenly said about the Wharf House. Well, that was the very house that I was born in. And it was lovely to look round and see how it was then, because that has been changed as well. But I still saw that night at the museum the window of the room where I first saw the light of day, and that was wonderful.
Although not modelled at Pendon, Uffington Station was for many years a busy junction on the Great Western Railway. In 1864, a consortium of Farringdon businessmen opened a single broad-gauge branch line between Farringdon and Uffington Junction, one of the few remaining elements of which is the Junction Hotel, now a private dwelling. An early timetable shows a scheduled time of 15 minutes for the 3.5-mile journey from Farringdon to Uffington Junction, although if Uffington Village was your destination, you still had 1.25 miles to travel by road. Passenger traffic on the branch line peaked in 1913, then declined, and in 1951 passenger services were withdrawn. Freight traffic continued to use the branch line until the Beeching Cuts of 1964. The small hamlet of Balking currently has a population of about 100. It would have been considerably busier in the past, as it had an ancient market charter. Balking is one of the few places in the country where fuller's earth has been quarried. It has been mined in England since Roman times and is a greyish-brown mineral-rich clay valued for its absorbent qualities. It has many uses, including cosmetics, brewing, special effects in films, and as the mud used for drilling oil wells. Balking was the last fuller's earth quarry in the country and closed in 2002. The Church of St Nicholas is on Station Road, the station being the former Uffington Junction, which was just a few hundred yards away. The church was built at the beginning of the 13th century, and for over 400 years it kept an intriguing secret. Opposite the entrance on the north wall, there is a series of 14th century paintings. These simple works of art were hidden under coats of plaster during the Reformation in the mid-1500s, until they were discovered during repairs to the nave in the 1980s. Church Cottage lies just south of the church and is modelled at Pendon as Balking Cottage. It has black and white timber-framed walls with brick infill and a thatched roof with eyebrow dormers. It was restored in the 1930s and again, including some alterations, in the 1960s by the present owners, the Logan family. Ian Logan was responsible for establishing and developing the Fuller's Earth quarry. Britchcom Farm is in a beautiful location immediately below the Uffington White Horse, on the road that runs along the foot of the Ridgeway. The White Horse dates from the Iron Age, about 750 BC, and the view on the opening title of this series is from the top of White Horse Hill. The oldest part of Britchcom farmhouse is thought to date from about 1690 and was constructed from chalkstone rubble with brick quoins. The house sits on chalk and has an underground stream flowing beneath it, which may explain what happened about 270 years later. In the late 18th century, the north-south wing was increased in height and encased in brickwork in a classic Georgian symmetrical style. Later on, the wing was extended, resulting in the asymmetrical west elevation. The roofs are a mixture of tiles, Welsh slate, Stonesfield slate and West Country slate. In the 1930s, the farm had a number of iconic outbuildings, all of which are modelled at Pendon. These include two large thatch barns, one of chalkstone dating from 1692 and one of weatherboard probably built in 1728, a coach house, a cart shed, a cowshed and also an 18th century dovecote, one of the largest in England with nearly 1,400 nesting holes. The dovecote was later converted into a granary and is the only listed building on the farm. In the early 1960s, the farm was modernised. Some of the original buildings, including the large historic barns, were replaced by modern equivalents. Around the same time, most of the north front wall of the house collapsed as a result of subsidence. Prior to the construction of the Pendon model of the farm as it was in the 1930s, the collapse and demolition of some of the original buildings meant that plans and elevations had to be prepared by Pendon surveyors, using existing photographs and notes, and through new surveys of the farm. Valuable background information that was used in the creation of Pendon's model was provided by Marcella Seymour, who moved to the farm with her parents as a baby in 1929 and lived there until her death in 2019. Life on the farm as a child in the 1930s was quite an adventure. Marcella Seymour.
I thought it was absolutely out of this world when I first saw the replica of Britchcom Farm. The buildings, the house, it brought back so many memories. Today the house doesn't capture any of the old niceness like it did in those days. And to see it in miniature at Pendon, I think they've done a wonderful job. I really do. We had a beautiful barn out here where it's the paddock now. That barn went in the early 60s, I believe, when the person who bought the farm didn't want any buildings between the road and the house, so they pushed all that down. Underneath the old dovecote, which was, there was bins in there where you stored the corn, and they were all upon saddle stones. It was to stop any little animals getting in. And then there was two open entrances at the end, and of course the hens would always go into a dark place. So because I was the smallest about here, I was asked to go under there. I didn't very much like it though, because the further you went in, the darker it was. I was always glad to find an egg and get out a bit quick. There was another tale when they built a new toilet at Britchcom, brick built, and the carpenters come and made all these elaborate seats. This was supposed to be wonderful. And then somebody else come and led a cement floor. But I don't quite know, they couldn't have been very well up with their work, because they made it that it all run to the middle where you were walking. I don't mean the bucket or anything like that, but where you were walking. So when you scrubbed it out, the water went to the middle. So the tale went round the estate that when my ancestors wanted to go to the toilet, they had to put Wellingtons on to paddle through the water. And then I understand though, at Pendon Museum, They got a little old Dutch now in their Wellingtons outside the door.
In the 1960s, the appearance of the house changed substantially.
That was when I was in bed one night. I thought, wonder what that creaking is. And then it carried on creaking. There was quite a bit of creaking, and then I mentioned it to the owners. And that's when they decided that the foundations on the main wall were gone. And that's when there was 1 or 2 more windows put in there, and the well filled in. I was sorry the well was filled in though. It used to be great fun really as a nipper. You'd put the handle up high, then sit on it, and eventually you managed to get some water up yourself.
Waterfall Cottage is in the village of Woolston, about 1.5 miles from Uffington, travelling west along the spring line. It's a small village of about 250 people and is an ancient settlement. Just west of the village are the remains of a Roman villa uncovered in 1884 by a steam plough. Woolston is a springline village with a group of springs, the Woolston Wells, in the chalk escarpment just to the south. These springline settlements occur where a ridge of permeable rock lies over impermeable rock, resulting in a line of springs along the contact between the 2 layers. Building higher up the hill would have meant difficulties with water supply. Building lower would have taken the settlement further away from useful grazing land or nearer to the floodplain. As is typical of this kind of settlement, Woolston is a linear village, long and thin, embracing both low-lying land in the Vale and upland pasture on the Downs. Waterfall Cottage, which is called Mill Cottage in the Vale scene at Pendon, was built in 1610 adjacent to the former village watermill and was for some time the miller's house. The mill itself was demolished in about 1850. The small panelled timber-framed walls of Waterfall Cottage have wattle and daub infill, but the rear wall is constructed of chalkstone. The thatcher has left his signature on the roof. This episode of Views of the Vale ends back in Fernham, a picturesque Vale village that was once a thriving community with 3 general stores and other shops and businesses, but is now a rather quiet village. 4 locations in Fernham are modelled at Pendon, and all are within sight of each other here. However, as with other models, they aren't necessarily located in the same relative positions in Pendon's diorama. A recent visitor to Pendon is Fernham resident Jane Rice.
I took my children when they were quite young, and we went because we wanted to see the model railways. We started walking around, and I was quite surprised when we came across the Vale scene, and we started to see buildings that we recognised from all around the Vale of the White Horse. And then we actually found buildings that were in Fernham that were right next to where we lived, and the children were very excited by that, and they really enjoyed their day out there.
Close to the village centre there is a slate-roofed water pump canopy. In the 1930s there was no mains water in the village, and this pump would have been the usual way of obtaining water for both domestic and business use. The pump was removed some time ago, and the 8-foot deep well is capped. During its lifetime, the canopy has been much repaired and renewed. Originally it was made of softwood, but in 2007, funded by a precept on council tax, it was replaced with an attractive oak-framed construction, built by a specialist joiner from Uffington. In the Vale scene at Pendon, as you turn the corner of the diorama into the upper gallery, the model of the pump can be found to the left of the chapel group, a group of buildings featured in another episode of this series. Next to the Fernham village pump is Keeper's Cottage. Originally 2 cottages, Keeper's Cottage is now a single dwelling. One of the original cottages was constructed in stone, and the other was timber-framed with wattle and daub infill. The Pendon model is located close to a shop and barn from Wanborough that are also featured in another episode of this series. One part of the model that might be missed during a visit to Pendon is its wonderfully detailed privy. Across the road from Keeper's Cottage is Silvertrees, a small building next to the church. It was at one time a schoolroom, later on becoming a hurdlemaker's property, which is how the building is modelled at the museum, where it is known as Hurdlemaker's Cottage. The clamp used in hurdle making was still in the building in 1972, when work on the Pendon model started. For many years it was left empty and then used as a shed, the original thatch having been replaced with corrugated iron, as can be seen today. Recently it has been given a significant refurbishment by a local businessman. Corner Cottage was part of a terrace of 4 cottages, some of which were demolished in 1977 and replaced by bungalows. The demolished buildings, called fern cottages, were built in the late 18th or early 19th century, with stone walls and clay roof tiles. Corner Cottage, which was originally 2 dwellings, is now a single dwelling. Built in the 18th century, it has timber frames with brick infill and a rather unusual and eye-catching pattern of framing on the east wall. It has a thatched roof and may once have been a farm building. Fortunately, both Corner Cottage and the adjacent fern cottages were surveyed by the Pendon team in 1956 and again in 1963, and the Pendon model is a complete record of the appearance of these buildings as they were in the 1930s.
We've reached the end of this episode of Views of the Vale. If this is the first episode you have seen, please spend some time looking at other episodes. The series has 10 episodes in all. In the series, we are visiting many of the villages in the Vale of White Horse, looking at the buildings modelled at Pendon and showing you the features that made them such interesting subjects for the model makers, and providing some insights into how rural life experience has changed in the last 90 or so years. On the Pendon website, you will also find a series of walks in the Vale, including one that goes close to where we have been in this episode. We hope you have enjoyed this short video. We have a lot more from Pendon to share with you, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel, which we update regularly.